The curtains at the window, though the window be up, won't even be moved by the winds of emotion. Simply because this house is built on strength, divine strength. This is a house formed by knowledge.
From leaders who claim to have been taken into spaceships to meet with the angels, to twisted leaders who exploited everyone from children to vulnerable women, these are the top 10 black cults, part 1. Just a fair warning, number 1 will disturb you. Royal Jenkins, the United Nation of Islam. He claimed to be Allah in person, literally. His followers worked without pay, children were separated from their families, and a sprawling network of businesses became a front for one of the most disturbing systems of religious exploitation in modern black history. This is the story of Royal Jenkins and the United Nation of Islam. Royal Jenkins was once a member of the original Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad. Like many others in the 20th century, he was drawn to the NOI's message of black independence, self-determination, and rejection of Western oppression. By the early 1970s, he declared a new revelation, that he had been taken up into a spaceship, met with angels, and returned to earth as the embodiment of Allah. He was no longer a student of divine knowledge. In his words, he was the source. This revelation marked the beginning of the United Nation of Islam, UNOI, a splinter organization that would grow into a dangerous multi-city movement. Under Jenkins' guidance, the UNOI established a network of restaurants, schools, clothing shops, gas stations, and other businesses, mostly staffed by his followers. To outsiders, it appeared to be a model of self-reliant black capitalism and faith-driven economic success. But behind the polished public image was a brutal internal structure built on unpaid labor. Reports from survivors detail children working grueling hours in kitchens and stores, often underfed and forced to sleep on the floor in unsanitary conditions. In one documented case, a girl diagnosed with cancer was not taken to a doctor until she was gravely ill. She died shortly after being removed from the UNOI compound. Female followers were expected to remain with certain physical standards with strict rules about weight, diet, and behavior, and to submit entirely to male authority, which was often equated with divine will. Disobedience was punished harshly. The movement operated across multiple U.S. cities, including Kansas City, Kansas, its headquarters, Atlanta, Newark, and New York. In many of these places, local authorities were either unaware of the extent of the group's practices. In Kansas City, the local government even donated buildings to the UNOI in an attempt to revitalize neighborhoods, unwittingly empowering a cult system. After decades of unchecked control, survivors who escaped began speaking out. Among them was Kendra Ross, who had been raised in the UNOI from childhood. In a landmark case, her legal team documented how she had been forced to work without compensation from the age of 11 to 21. In 2018, Ross was awarded $8 million in damages, the largest known judgment against a U.S.-based human trafficking organization. The case brought renewed scrutiny to the UNOI and finally exposed the full scope of its internal practices. Despite Jenkins' death from COVID-19 in 2021, remnants of the UNOI still exist. His teachings remain preserved through his followers, including his wife, reportedly also his stepdaughter, who has been involved in efforts to sustain his legacy. But the public image of the UNOI as a divine black nationalist project has largely unraveled. King Louie Narcissus, Mount Zion Spiritual Temple. Born in New Orleans in 1921, Louie Narcissus moved to California during World War II, settling in the East Bay. In 1945, he founded the Mount Zion Spiritual Temple in Oakland. Within a few years, the temple became the epicenter of his expanding religious kingdom. Unlike many religious leaders who concealed their influence behind humility, Narcissus embraced a regal persona. He dressed in royal garments, robes, crowns, sashes, and held extravagant ceremonies. He was addressed as King Louie. At its height, The Mount Zion Spiritual Temple had chapters in Sacramento, Detroit, and Houston. While smaller than national movements like the Nation of Islam or Father Divine's Peace Mission, it commanded a deeply loyal and tightly organized following. Within the community, Narcissus' word was final. His interpretations of Scripture was not open to debate. He was seen not only as a pastor or bishop, but as a literal manifestation of God's order on earth. Despite his grandeur, Narcissus retained a musical and cultural influence that extended beyond the pulpit. He recorded several albums, combining spiritual messaging with gospel music. One of his early supporters was none other than Mahalia Jackson, the iconic gospel singer. His niece was Bessie Griffin, a respected gospel artist in her own right. But behind the pageantry, Narcissus demanded total allegiance from his followers. While public allegations of physical abuse or criminal behavior were never officially brought forward, the movement maintained a strict social hierarchy and discouraged any opposition. His followers were expected to sever ties with worldly associations and devote themselves entirely to the temple's mission. What distinguished Narcissus, however, was the emphasis on divine royalty. His teachings centered not just on spiritual salvation, but on divine lineage, with himself as the chosen heir of a sacred throne. Followers were not merely worshiping God through him, they were worshiping God as him. Narcissus' death came suddenly. In 1989, he suffered a heart attack at his mansion in Detroit and passed away at the age of 68. Without a clearly designated successor or formal leadership structure beyond his personal charisma, the movement quickly declined. Branches closed, and the Oakland headquarters lost much of its former influence. Today, the Mount Zion Spiritual Temple exists more as a historical memory than an active institution. Anna Young, the House of Prayer for All People. In the quiet rural town of Mycanopy, Florida, nestled behind trees and down an unassuming road, there once stood a place called the House of Prayer for All People. To outsiders, it was a modest religious compound, but behind the walls, a far darker truth lived, a truth that would take decades to fully come to light. This was the domain of Anna Young, a woman who styled herself as a holy leader, a prophet, and a matriarch of righteousness. To her followers, she was strict but godly, chosen by a higher power to guide the wayward toward salvation. But to those who lived under her rule, she was something else entirely. She wasn't just a preacher, she was a cult leader, one who used the Bible to justify cruelty. Anna Young began her ministry in the 1980s, attracting mostly women and children seeking stability and protection. But once inside her world, followers were met with an environment of fear, control, and violence. She enforced a brutal interpretation of Scripture. Children were beaten in the name of obedience. Those she deemed sinful were denied food, kept in isolation, and sometimes subjected to makeshift exorcisms. The House of Prayer was not large. It operated far from major cities, its reach more spiritual than geographic. Young taught her followers that suffering was a necessary path to righteousness, that pain was purification, that questioning her authority was akin to rebelling against God. There were stories of kids being forced to sleep outside in the cold, naked, with nothing but a sheet of plastic for cover. Others were locked in closets. Any display of disobedience, something as simple as not making eye contact or eating too slowly, could trigger hours of punishment. One of the most devastating cases was that of Eamon Harper, a toddler who disappeared in the early 1990s. His mother, a member of the House of Prayer, put her trust in Young to raise him in godliness. But Eamon never left the compound alive. Years passed before authorities knew he was even missing. Young and her daughter lied to the mother, claiming that relatives had taken the child elsewhere. In truth, the boy had died, allegedly from one of the punishments, and his body was never found. It wasn't until 2016 that new testimony reopened the investigation into Eamon's death. Former followers, finally freed from the psychological grip of the cult, began to speak out. They told stories that stretched back decades. In 2017, Anna Young was arrested and charged with manslaughter and child endangerment. In court, prosecutors laid out a disturbing portrait of her control. Young eventually pleaded no contest to the manslaughter of Eamon Harper and the abuse of other children. In 2021, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The house of prayer no longer exists. The land is quiet now, but for those who live there, the echoes remain. Survivors speak of decades spent rebuilding their identities, unraveling the beliefs that were drilled into them as children. Yahweh Ben Yahweh, the nation of Yahweh. In the late 1970s, a man named Hewlin Mitchell Jr. emerged in Miami with a mission. He called himself Yahweh Ben Yahweh, meaning God, the Son of God, and declared himself a Messiah, sent to deliver black people from spiritual and racial bondage. The organization he founded, the Nation of Yahweh, grew rapidly. In Miami's Liberty City neighborhood and beyond, followers adopted white robes and turbans, referred to him as the Master, which is ironic considering he was supposedly against racial bondage. They gave up their personal identities to serve the mission. By the early 1980s, the nation had established temples, businesses, and schools across multiple states. But behind the visible structure of commerce and culture was a tightly controlled, secretive community, ruled by an absolute order. He was not to be questioned. Followers who showed signs of resistance were labeled as traitors or infidels. Central to Yahweh's doctrine was the belief that black people were the true Israelites, the chosen people of God, and that white people were inherently evil, labeled as devils. By the mid-1980s, a group within the nation known as the Circle of Ten began committing acts of violence, allegedly at Yahweh's instruction. Former insiders would later testify that he ordered or approved targeted attacks against individuals who posed a threat to the nation's expansion or questioned his authority. One of the most chilling attacks was that of Ashton Green, a former member found decapitated in 1986. Other members were attacked in various ways, many in execution-style killings. Some were ex-members accused of betrayal. Yet, even as these crimes were committed, Yahweh Ben Yahweh continued to present a polished public image. He hosted elaborate ceremonies, welcomed political leaders to his headquarters, and maintained a consistent message of economic revival and religious awakening for black communities. That public image began to unravel in 1990 when the FBI and federal prosecutors launched a sweeping investigation into the Nation of Yahweh. After gathering testimonies from former members, informants, and survivors, authorities indicted Yahweh and several of his followers on RICO, Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and extortion. The trial began in 1992. Prosecutors detailed how dissenters were beaten, how homes of non-believers were burned, and how murder became a tool of control. Central to the case were testimonies from former nation insiders. One of the most haunting testimonies came from a man who claimed he was ordered to eliminate his roommate after the roommate made critical comments about Yahweh Ben Yahweh. It was carried out in silence, the body disposed of, and the act justified as divine justice. Despite the overwhelming nature of the allegations, Yahweh Ben Yahweh was not convicted of the murders themselves. Instead, in 1992, he was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, not direct homicide. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Several of his top followers received similar sentences or plea deals. He served 11 years before being released on parole in 2001 under strict conditions. One of those conditions barred him from associating with the Nation of Yahweh or engaging in public religious preaching. In 2007, Yahweh Ben Yahweh died from prostate cancer at the age of 71. Today, the Nation of Yahweh's physical structures are mostly gone. The once vibrant compounds have either been sold, demolished, or repurposed. Father Divine, International Peace Mission. In the depths of the Great Depression, a man emerged from relative obscurity and declared himself God himself. You might be noticing a pattern here. He promised salvation without death, prosperity without greed, and a life free of suffering. That man was known as Father Divine, and for decades his followers believed him. Father Divine rose in prominence in the 1910s and 20s through a unique blend of Pentecostal-style preaching, personal charisma, and radical spiritual doctrine. He founded the International Peace Mission Movement, which expanded throughout New York, Pennsylvania, and eventually nationwide. What set Father Divine apart was the boldness of his claim. He was God in human form. He preached the message of divine metaphysics, teaching that God had come to earth to establish heaven on earth through righteous living, racial harmony, and economic equality. And people believed him. Thousands of followers, black, white, working class, poor, joined his peace mission. The peace mission had strict rules. Celibacy was enforced, even within marriage. Substances and profanity were forbidden. Men and women lived separately, even when married, and romantic relationships were discouraged. He also claimed that through obedience to him, illness, poverty, and even death could be conquered. He told his followers he would never die. He and his followers purchased hotels, restaurants, businesses, and homes across the country. All were operated under the collective identity of the peace mission. They served meals to the poor, hosted mass banquets, and provided housing to those in need. But it was not a utopia. Followers worked long hours without pay, surrendering personal possessions, income, and often family ties to the movement. Critics accused Father Divine of using spiritual authority to live lavishly, residing in elegant mansions, eating gourmet meals, and traveling with an entourage while preaching humility. Father Divine denied these claims, insisting that any comfort he enjoyed was a reflection of the collective spiritual prosperity of his flock. Still, questioning his authority was unthinkable. He communicated through carefully staged addresses, controlling the narrative and limiting access to himself. Then came 1942, and with it, a seismic shift. That year, Father Divine married a young white Canadian woman named Edna Rose Richings, known within the movement as Sweet Angel. The marriage stunned his followers because he had insisted on celibacy and spiritual purity. To explain the marriage, he told his followers that Edna was the reincarnation of his first wife who had died the year before. He assured them that it was a spiritual union, entirely celibate, and that it served a divine purpose. Though some were skeptical, most remained loyal. Still, by the 1950s, the peace mission was in decline. New spiritual movements were rising, civil rights activism was reshaping black political life, and the strict doctrines of Father Divine began to lose cultural traction. Then, in 1965, the unthinkable happened. Father Divine died. Officially, the peace mission insisted that he had not died. His body, they claimed, was just resting. Sweet Angel, his wife, continued to lead the movement under the belief that Father Divine still guided her and the mission. But without Father Divine's commanding presence, its numbers dwindled. Today, only a handful of followers remain. The once thriving mansions and temples have either been abandoned, repurposed, or quietly maintained by aging devotees. Malachi Z York, Nubian Nation of Moors. Born Dwight D. York in 1945, he first rose to prominence in the 1970s as the leader of the Ansaru Allah community, a black Muslim sect based in Brooklyn, New York. At the time, York claimed to be a reformer of Islam, calling his followers to stricter purity, separation from Western influences, and a vision of African spiritual awakening. But York's teachings were fluid. Over time, his rhetoric evolved to include elements of Egyptology, Freemasonry, Gnosticism, UFO mythology, and pseudoscientific theories about race and cosmology. He changed the name of his organization multiple times, from the Ansar Pure Sufi to the Holy Tabernacle Ministries, to the United Nuwaubian Nations of Moors, and finally to the Yamasee Native American Moors of the Creek Nation. With every shift, York's identity transformed. He claimed to be a Muslim imam, then a reincarnated pharaoh, then an extraterrestrial from the planet Rizq. His followers referred to him as the Supreme Grand Master Teacher. In 1993, York moved his followers from Brooklyn to Georgia, where they constructed the Tama-Re compound, a 400-acre complex designed to resemble an ancient Egyptian city. The compound featured pyramids, statues of Nubian rulers, temples, and even a replica of the Sphinx. York claimed it was the true Holy Land, a gateway for ascension, and the epicenter of divine truth on earth. Inside Tama-Re, York exercised total control. They were taught that the world outside was poisoned by Luciferian influence. He published hundreds of books, most written under different pseudonyms. Many of his teachings were pseudo-historical and conspiratorial, but his followers internalized them as gospel. He rebranded racial identity, redefined history, and offered a narrative in which black people were divine, ancient, and cosmic in origin, trapped in a society designed to keep them spiritually asleep. By the early 2000s, allegations began to surface that York was SAing children on the compound. Survivors testified that they were groomed from a young age, isolated from their families, and forced into the acts under the guise of spiritual rituals. In 2002, the FBI and Georgia Bureau of Investigation raided the compound following a lengthy investigation. What they found shocked even seasoned law enforcement. Dozens of minors had been victimized. Over 100 criminal counts were filed against York. The case against York was one of the largest and most disturbing child SA prosecutions in U.S. history. He was convicted on all major counts and sentenced to 135 years in federal prison. Tama-Re was soon demolished. Many former followers struggled with the trauma of betrayal. Some had lost entire families to the movement. Others had given decades of their lives to building what they believed was a spiritual nation. If you found this video entertaining, hit the like and subscribe button for more deep dives into the world of rich black history. Drop a comment below and let us know which story surprised or resonated with you the most.